Welcome to The Gathering.
In the last podcast on creating the American Renaissance, we discussed the important first step in achieving this goal, dismantling the deep state by reestablishing congressional authority. In this segment, we'll be discussing the second vital step, returning more decision-making power to the states and local governments. This process has been termed subsidiarity, and what that means is returning power to the lowest level or subsidiary level where it can be most effective. Doing this is important for three reasons: historical, political, and practical. Let's take a look at each of these. From a historical standpoint, when the Founding Fathers framed the Constitution, what they had in mind was 13 fairly self-governing states with the federal government having very limited powers. Those were the power to create treaties and foreign agreements, the power to create and maintain an army, the power to declare war, the power to make laws, the power to regulate interstate commerce, the power to establish post offices and roads, the power to borrow money, coin money, and collect taxes, the power to create subsidiary courts below the Supreme Court. Notice now how limited these powers are and the type of nation they envisaged. The first three powers deal with international affairs and the defense of the nation. Some power had to be created to defend the individual states from outside aggression and guarantee their safety. They deal with external relations only, not internal relations among the states. Powers 4 through 6 deal with trade and communication between the states, assuring a free flow of goods and communication. Nowhere do we see the government empowered to interfere with the internal governance of the states. In the seventh power, we see the necessity for the federal government to finance its activities, and in the eighth, its ability to establish inferior courts subject at all times to the authority of the Supreme Court, a co-equal branch of government. One can see from this initial enumeration of powers that the states were to be left pretty much alone to govern their own affairs at the state, county, and municipal level. The role of the federal government being limited to defense and interaction between the states. De Tocqueville admired America's early sense of subsidiarity, noting that decisions were best made by what he called associations, groups of local people working together and deciding for themselves the solutions to their problems. Abraham Lincoln reiterated this idea, stating, "In all that people can individually do as well for themselves, government ought not interfere." We've come a long way from this initial conception of government, with the creation of the deep state and liberal courts extending the powers of the federal government through dubious interpretations of the Commerce Clause and other federal powers. So much so that we feel the influence of the federal government in virtually every aspect of our lives. Now that we've discussed these historical issues, let's look at the political issues. Politically, our nation is more divided than any time since the Civil War. This is due to our two distinct and conflicting cultures. Roughly speaking, we have a middle class that is family-oriented, often religious, with strong ethical values, adverse to authority, and any interference in the decisions that govern their lives. They are the ones who feel most acutely the burden of bad economic policies and radical utopian ideas. Posed against this group is an elite class, secular, materialist, largely uninterested in or adverse to the family, that clearly believes it has the wisdom and insight to make rules that others must live by, whether they like them or not, in order to create what they see as an ideal society, one whose consequences they are largely insulated from. Their utopian vision is governed by the radical positions of the day. They are the people who would allow abortion to the moment of birth, create asylum states like Minnesota, where minor children can be taken away from their parents if they do not consent to their physical transitioning. And children from other states may flee in order to transition against their parents' will. Aligned with these elites are millions of welfare recipients who support them for continuing and increasing their benefits. These two groups, with their contradicting values and assumptions, cannot be reconciled. When one group wins and the other loses, you end up with what has been termed the tyranny of the majority, a situation where a very large proportion of society is forced to live under laws they do not consent to, precisely the reason for the American Revolution enunciated in the Declaration of Independence. The only solution to this problem of the tyranny of the majority is a redefinition of the federal government, an absolutely enormous task. It's made up of two parts: the dismantling of the deep state and the return of most of the duties performed by the federal government back to the states. There is ample authority for this, beginning with the original intent of our founding fathers, coupled with the clear language of the 10th Amendment. According to the 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Fortunately, the Supreme Court is becoming more sympathetic to this point of view. In recent decisions, the court has emphasized the concept of originalism, the idea that constitutional issues should be decided in terms of what the Founding Fathers intended and the traditions of those times. It was originalism in the Dobbs decision that returned the right to make laws on abortion to the states. Relying on the 10th Amendment in returning the power to legislate on abortion, the court stated, "The Constitution makes no reference to abortion, and no such right is implicitly protected by any constitutional provision." The Supreme Court is becoming more and more sensitive to states' rights and the overreach of federal law. In his new book, Overruled: The Human Toll of Too Much Law, Justice Gorsuch points out how too much law destroys individual rights. He states, "There were just so many cases that came to be in which I saw ordinary Americans, just everyday regular people trying to go about their lives, not trying to hurt anybody or do anything wrong, and just getting whacked unexpectedly by some legal rule they didn't know about. The problem," he said, "is that there has been an explosion of laws and regulation at both the federal and state levels. The sheer volume of Congress's output for the past decade is overwhelming, averaging 344 pieces of legislation totaling 2 to 3 million words a year." Both Justice Gorsuch and the conservative majority on the court are becoming more sensitive to the issues of federal overreach and states' rights, but it'll take more than a sympathetic judiciary to solve this problem. What is needed is a massive review of federal legislation and repeal of innumerable unnecessary laws and regulations, in addition to decriminalizing many laws and making them civil infractions. A good example of this is our tax laws, which make underpayment and avoidance of payment a criminal offense. Why should it be when so many countries like Switzerland treat it as a civil offense? You owe us money, so we're going to sue you and add a civil penalty. Too many of our laws and regulations have penalties that criminalize behaviors that most of us aren't even aware of. Problems are best solved in the context where they arise. It is the people who are most affected by them that have the most insight into the nature of the problem. This doesn't mean that they may not hire outside experts on a particular issue to advise them, but it does mean that they get to choose which one of the solutions any of them may offer. This is called consent of the governed, and it is a critical component of a functional democracy. If the solution doesn't work, they can quickly get rid of it and try something else. They have a vested interest in doing so since they're the ones affected by it. No lengthy bureaucratic process, no committee hearings to go through, just quick, effective action. And this can be done in local communities where it's a community problem, the county level for a county problem, and the state level for a state problem. Decisions ought to be made by those closest to the problem who know the most about its effects. It's called the consent of the governed. Adopting the approach of returning more power to the states and having policies made by people affected by them will go a long way in ending our cultural civil war, a war that may escalate in many unpleasant ways. California is as different from Texas as Vermont is from Florida. Let each state and local community solve their problems in their own way and allow others to follow their own path. Sooner or later, the states with unworkable policies will be forced to do what works or force collapse. Those that follow good policies generated locally will thrive and draw others from the collapsed states. Why should someone in Texas care if another state has a bad tax and business policies that are hurting that state's economy if it doesn't affect Texas? This also allows people greater choices of where they want to live. Returning power to the states will not be an easy task. The American Renaissance will take an enormous amount of work, struggle, and even some pain. Our founding fathers knew the cost of building this great nation. Rebuilding it may be just as difficult, but isn't it worth it? For The Gathering, I'm Leonardo Radomile. Thanks for listening, and if you like what you heard, give us a quick thumbs up and subscribe. To learn more about The Gathering and our free course, check out our webpage. You'll find the link below.